This podcast contains our own personal views, not associated with any organisation.
Coronial contains descriptions of death inquests that may be graphic and disturbing to some listeners.
Discretion is advised.
It's just nothing anyone would have foreseen, I don't think.
All three skydivers lived in Mission Beach. Peter and Kerry collided with Toby as Toby's main parachute was prematurely deploying. There was a reason he was so close to them, but he shouldn't necessarily have been directly underneath.
He would have been going in an upwards direction relative to the tandem pair who had not deployed their parachute. The manufacturer's recommendations warned that packing the wrong size canopy into the racer could increase the likelihood of a premature pack opening.
Welcome back, everybody, to Coronial. I'm Georgie.
I'm Alice.
I'm Emma.
So, the next part being, how do we work on this? How do we regulate this and recommend things? You guys have both sort of talked about the Australian Parachuting Federation, the APF.
Not the AFP.
So I'll just quickly touch on, there were a number of different authorities that are involved in regulation of skydiving, which I also enjoyed because it actually is legislated by the Civil Aviation Act, which I was like, oh.
I mean, makes sense.
I suppose you have to use a plane to skydive. Unless you're base jumping, but that's totally
It's something
different.
flying and using up
Airspace.
aviation space.
And you can't have a plane
Nah.
in the same airspace as the
Absolutely not.
skydivers.
Yeah.
Apart from the plane that drops them.
And then there's also the Civil Aviation Regulations. Oh, and the Civil Aviation Safety Regulations. But realistically, a lot of this is then essentially overseen by the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, or CASA. And basically they provide regulation to the skydiving industry. So then they sort of feed back to the Australian Parachuting Federation. But then in conjunction, the Australian Parachuting Federation might make regulations to the members of that federation, but in consultation with CASA. And so obviously if any of those regulations breach statutory framework, CASA's going to be like, yeah, no, we don't consent to you
Just no.
having that regulation. It's just two bodies working together to essentially come up with reasonable regulations. And then the Australian Parachuting Federation actually has the main regulation that is talked about in this inquest is the operational regulations, which is like a 37-page document that is essentially all members should follow these specific regulations. And then there's a few other sort of side guidelines and that kind of stuff, but they don't become relevant to this inquest particularly, such as a jump pilot manual and some other regulatory schedules. That's how that kind of all works. So ultimately, APF, they actually came up with their own recommendations that they presented to the coroner when they had completed their inquest, which, as I said, was conducted by the National Safety and Training Manager. And their 4 recommendations were reinforce to all jumpers the dangers of being positioned during freefall either directly above or below skydivers. So I guess directly above. Technically, Kerry and Peter could have moved out of the way. But anyway.
Yeah, because they would have seen
They
him,
had more
but he wouldn't have
visualization.
seen- Yeah.
Yeah, because they would have been belly to earth, so they
So they
would
could have
have
seen
literally
them.
been looking down.
Yep.
But anyway, it didn't really actually talk about whether they should have moved. But I hadn't really realised that it said above and below. I'm like, oh yeah, the people above could have moved.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good point. They could
Yeah.
have.
Yeah. Standardised main parachute packing training, particularly in relation to the main canopy size and compatibility with containers, which I guess we haven't super touched on, but there are very, very strict regulations about what to do about a reserve parachute.
Yeah, I think I mentioned that in one of
Yeah.
mine, but there wasn't
But
as
there's
much to do
very
with
minimal around the actual main parachute, because the assumption is your reserve is the one that you need to have the regulation around.
because it doesn't get used.
But if I'm parachuting, which I'm never going to be, ideally I do want my main to work as well. I
Yeah.
prefer to not have to rely on the reserve.
Yeah.
Just personally.
And I do wonder if there's a thought of the main parachute gets deployed every single time you jump.
Fair.
So
So,
every
it's getting
single time you
repacked
jump,
and all
you're
that kind of stuff.
repacking it, you would notice if there's any defects or tears.
Yeah.
Whereas a reserve parachute ideally is just staying in its container, not being touched.
Used. Yeah. Fair.
So that was sort of my thought as to why there'd be regulations on the reserve and not the
yeah,
main.
yeah, true.
Well, I would just assume that there's more strict regulations on the reserve because it is your last line of
Yeah.
defense.
It's
And
the
so
backup.
if it-
But it surprised me that there wasn't a lot on the main. I think is more my
No,
concern.
I kind of understand it. Like, if you're going to put the
Regulation.
time and effort into something, make
True.
it a
Backup.
reserve if it's your last line of defense. Like, you
True.
want it to be...
True. Fair.
Because if all the regulations go into the main and none into the reserve, then...
No, yeah, I want it to go into both because I want to know that my main is also okay.
I mean, that's the intent, like, 99% of the time, but then sometimes things
It
go
doesn't
wrong,
work,
and that's why you have
why we have
reserve.
reserve. Yeah, fair.
Yeah.
Educate the jumpers on the importance of maintaining equipment and appropriate standard for any freefall orientation, rather than just the traditional belly to earth, which didn't really then touch on like standards around if you're
Like if you're allowed to
if you're not
No.
belly to earth, what you should do.
just flip yourself over.
Well, they just sort of said educate jumpers on the importance of that, but like then didn't really say
Talk
much
about
more
how.
about why or how.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, and then
Probably for the reasons we've touched on.
that it's dangerous, but again, like it didn't really
You would think
discourage it. It
go
just said
into
there's
it
a higher
more.
risk. Yeah.
Mhm.
And then operators introduced standards for solo equipment used in the commercial environment, which like this was a real crossover because he was on a solo jump, but
Mm.
then he interacted with people on a commercial jump.
Yes.
I guess it sounds like that happens not infrequently, but
Yeah.
It sounds like if there's a space.
but
Yeah.
whether if there's a space and you can go for a free jump, whether lots of people then interact with the others or whether they
Yeah,
just
they
go
just
have
do
their
their
free
own.
jump.
Yep.
Yeah. So there was no specific regulations dealing with your position in terms of separation when you're doing a jump involving relative work or flying as the tandem camera flyer in a tandem pair situation. But many witnesses, as I think both of you have mentioned, knew that in the industry you probably shouldn't do
Yeah.
that. As an alternative APF document, there was also a tandem endorsed guide, which did state a jumper should never pass underneath, but there was no other like specific regulation in like that operational regulation. And that tandem endorsement guide did say that that is not recommended because it specifically creates the risk for collision. Along with not passing directly below, the main APF operational regulations also stated that a parachutist must not engage in relative work with a tandem instructor carrying a tandem parachutist unless the parachute holder is of at least a certificate class C, which is at least 100 skydives,
Yeah.
which we've talked about. Toby was,
Well over that.
Yeah.
but along with that, they should also have the authorization of the drop zone safety officer. Now, I don't think either of you guys have specifically mentioned a drop zone safety
No.
officer, but
No.
it sounds like they are an individual that works for the organization that has a lot of safety and organization oversight to the specific commercial company. So in this instance, Skydiving Australia. And there is a regulation that you need to have a drop zone safety officer and that they need to be doing XYZ within the
Right.
organization for its safety.
And I'm pretty sure it mentioned that the plan wasn't originally for Toby to complete relative work with Peter and Kerry. Like,
Absolutely.
that wasn't, when they were on the ground, that was not the plan. But
Yep.
the plan between
Yeah.
the two of, well, the three of them changed at some point.
Yep.
While they were walking to the plane or got in the plane.
Yeah, so it
going to
suggested
the-
that potentially it was on the bus on the way
Yeah.
before they then got on the plane and ascended. And so part of the regulation was both the drop zone safety officer and the tandem instructor, which so therefore there was implied consent, but not necessarily written
Yeah.
from Peter because people that were around understood that they were jumping together and the fact that they jumped a second apart implied that
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
had
It was intentional.
yeah. But obviously, yeah, he didn't get the consent of the drop zone safety officer
Yeah.
because they already left. They weren't
Yeah.
at the drop zone at the time that they could do it. But because of, as you have mentioned, Emma, how professional everyone understood Toby to be,
Mm.
they suspected that like he would otherwise be asking for consent had that been planned prior.
Yeah, yeah.
And
He
so
would have made
that's a bit of
them
a
aware.
flaw in that regulation in terms of because, yeah, that plan might be made after you've already left
Yeah.
that area. The drop zone safety officer who had been working on the day said that had Toby approached him and asked that, he absolutely would have granted it anyway.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And then it's not like it was done with malice or poor intent by not approaching that. Toby otherwise would have done that had that plan have been made.
And again, like, you wonder, like, how many other times this has happened where they've decided
Yeah.
after
Yeah.
being able to contact the drop
Yeah.
zone safety officer that they want to do relative work. And again, it might just be that.
But it officially breaches said regulation that they're meant to.
But
abide
again,
by.
it's that normalization of deviance.
Exactly.
We've done it before and there's never been any issues.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Exactly.
and what harm would it cause generally?
Yeah.
None.
None, yeah.
Interestingly, one of the witnesses at the inquest did suggest that it should be prudent to obtain the informed consent of the student.
Sounds like she probably would have given that
It
consent. 'cause
sounds like
and
she
Peter were
did.
friends.
Like,
Yeah.
weren't they
She
talking
would've
about it on the
trusted
bus?
him.
But it should be written and documented
Yeah.
because they are signing so much. They
Yeah.
are the vulnerable individual in the
Yes,
situation.
They don't have the experience
And
or
that
the
there should be
skills.
evidence that they consented to that and that probably should happen on the ground in writing before they go up.
And I guess,
so I guess that was a
one
little bit
witness
fair.
said this. I get that, but like also hindsight, like
Yeah.
I'm sure this particular witness skydiver has probably done stuff like this in the past as well.
Oh,
Like,
I agree. But it does seem fair to me that if they're signing all that waiver around how much this could risk their death, that waiver probably should be like, I am, yes, happy or not happy for someone to come and interact with me in the air prior to them going up.
But
To
isn't
having
that the
consent.
same of them having themselves videoed and them being interacted with in the air with someone taking video footage of them?
Did they have written consent for that?
I don't know.
Yeah.
like,
I'm
I
not
think
sure.
that's what it's implying, but
Right.
I don't know. Yeah, I'm unclear. But yeah,
Because they're technically doing this. Well, then maybe not like fist bumping or shaking
Yeah.
hands,
Yeah.
but
So
they
they're
are
getting very
getting
close
right
as
up
well.
in their
Yeah.
faces.
yeah. And yeah, there was no requirement for that. So ultimately the coroner was like, yeah, I probably would recommend that you get
Yeah.
written consent from the student and that you are being more cautious or conscious about the fact that they should be getting consent on the ground before they go up. At the inquest, the Pike family, whose surname was Pike? Was that Kerry's?
Kerry,
Yeah. So Kerry's family actually requested that solo sports divers be prohibited from undertaking relative work with tandem skydivers. However,
Like, I understand that. Like, maybe with tandem skydivers where there's a student, but are they saying all tandem skydivers? Like, regardless of whether there are two expert
Yeah.
skydivers jumping tandem together? Nah.
yeah, like I guess they
Nah.
didn't differentiate that, but yeah, essentially the coroner also agreed, was like, it's relatively accepted in the industry. It's a good way for education and for them to learn how to be doing that. And then, yeah, the camera operators, you know, are there to record things and all that kind of stuff. And that it should only be experienced people that are interacting in that way anyway. So people that have at least 100 jumps in the APF regulation that you mentioned before, Alice, versus Skydive Australia required at least a D license, which is 200 jumps as well anyway.
Yeah.
So Skydive Australia does continue to allow employees and contractors to undertake sports jumps if there's available space on the plane, and then allows them to still interact and do relative work in that way.
Yeah, I completely agree with this. As we've already mentioned, this is a very risky sport, and if people have the experience to be able to do these sorts of things, undertake relative work and interact and things like that, they should be able to do it.
Yeah.
Knowing that there is risk involved.
Yeah, and it would be planned to the extent that the reason you're jumping out of the plane so close to each other in time is so that you can do that relative work. If you're not going to, like,
You're not
you
going to
would
jump
have
out
agreed on
together.
that beforehand. You're not going to jump out immediately after and be like, oh, wait, I want to do this.
Yeah.
And that's not to say I'm not sympathetic to Kerry's family's point of view. I do agree that although Kerry might have been fine and given her consent orally,
She may not have
this,
understood
exactly
the implications of it.
And so, yeah, doing it before you leave, but also having it properly explained to you.
Yep.
But also, like, not in a pressured
I
situation
was
when
about
you're
to
like already
also
in a
say
plane.
that. Like, you've got, you know,
Yeah.
your friend who you're tandem jumping with and
Yeah.
his friend, and they're talking together about being really excited about doing
And then
this
as you're
relative
like
work.
leaving the plane, they're like, we're going to
Exactly.
jump together, yeah?
Exactly. Like, I understand that.
Yeah. So coroner basically was like, yeah, you should probably just make sure that you get written informed consent of those students specifically. But people who are doing their own sports jumps, or as we've talked about, like professional, frequent skydivers, then fine. Like, they are doing a high risk sport, at which point they're probably aware of the risks of the relative work jumping, but the student may not be as well. And that could just go along with the waiver, so it's not that hard to incorporate in terms of the standard procedures along the way.
Yeah.
So next, in terms of the parachutes and packing and standardizing the packing of main parachutes, and then also information around solo equipment that doesn't have nearly as much regulation because it's their own personal gear.
Mm-hmm.
The APF regulations stipulated at the time the parachute system must be inspected and have its reserve parachute repacked every 12 months. As per the APF operational regulations, a parachute airworthiness certificate is required for a reserve parachute and confirms that the parachute has been independently checked and should not be worn unless it has this certification that it's airworthy.
Yep.
Yet there's no such requirement for main parachutes, as we've kind of already touched on.
Yep.
And then, as we've also touched on, all the main parachutes are then manufacturer specific. And in terms of then the APF trying to educate people or encourage people to make sure that they're all compatible and whatever, they have an online service bulletin which states parachute packing must be carried out in accordance with the manufacturer recommendations, and then provides a number of like additional links and resources for various manufacturers so that people can then go and check that.
Yep.
But then they also have this caveat on said page of every effort is made to maintain and update the list, but
yeah.
the APF makes no claim that it's either definitive nor exhaustive.
Yeah.
And so the users are then advised to contact manufacturers or federations or clubs or other regulatory bodies if they've got concerns about their equipment and how they're going to pack them. So it basically is like, do it correctly, but also it's hard to do.
Yeah.
And then it's really your problem to deal with.
So just do your best.
Yeah. So like I can understand why Toby wasn't able to necessarily figure out whether his pack was compatible.
Yeah.
Like again, we don't know how much like he looked into it, but it was clearly not an easy task to just like look
To
this
just
up
quickly
and happy days.
double-check, yeah.
Yeah, I guess they found it in the inquest, but I don't see the average person.
Well, I mean, the coroner found that on the paper, the precise parachute that was used in the precise container that were used were incompatible. That's just based on the manufacturer's guidelines, nothing else really.
Yeah,
is what
okay.
his findings were based on.
Fair. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think about when I buy things and I'm like, do I read the instructions?
Yeah.
But do I do that and then jump out of a plane?
I was
So-
going to say it depends on
the risk
on what
involved.
you're doing.
Yeah.
What I'm doing, yeah.
And then additionally, parachute assembly may comprise of components from a number of different manufacturers. So
Yeah.
it then
Bit of a
becomes
mix and
more
match.
complex depending on how many extra components from various manufacturers and then how compatible one manufacturer is with another and the large worldwide availability that there are of parachutes now as well. That makes it, again, the parachutist becomes the one with the ultimate responsibility for determining the airworthiness of it, especially when they're jumping in that sports environment where they are responsible for their own equipment.
Yep.
It's just like anything really, like any sport that you're doing solo. Like you're always responsible for your own
Equipment.
your own
Yeah.
car, your own whatever.
Yeah. But I guess less so when you're then packing a reserve because there's more strict requirements around that. And someone has to be checking over that those things are compatible.
Yeah, and I suppose it's like I don't think there'd be very many people who would be skydiving without the support of a company. Like even if you're doing your own solo dive,
Yeah.
you know, you probably don't have a friend with a plane who's just going to fly up and you're going to jump out. Like so they would be checking the certification of that reserve parachute.
Yeah.
It's not like, oh, you can just pretend you've got one and keep using it.
Yeah.
Because there would be people who would be checking that you've got it before you jumped.
Yeah.
Except if you own a piece of show fair equipment, then you just fudge your registration.
Yeah.
Throwback.
Whoops. That's the first thing that came to mind.
So it is known and documented in the Federal Aviation Authority Rigger Handbook. Riggers are just one of the checkers of parachutes that are very high level and high trained and so deal with checking of a lot of the reserve parachutes. That mismatched components are among the most frequent problems found in the field. And that many riggers are under the impression that they can freely interchange component parts, but this may be done only within certain limits. Specifically, when various parachute components are interchanged, the parachute rigger should follow the canopy's manufacturer instructions as well as the container instructions. However, the container manufacturer's instructions take precedent when there's conflict between the two.
Okay.
And that finally, of lesser or greater pack volume than the intended design criteria for the specific size container should not be installed.
Yeah, so don't use a parachute that's too big or too small.
Yeah, because of the concern about the improper functioning. So the APF regulations, as I sort of mentioned, leaves the responsibility on the individual However, there's also the secondary responsibility on the drop zone safety officer to ensure that there's a reasonable system in place to ensure that equipment is compliant. So basically saying that they are responsible for ensuring defects in equipment are reported to the packers and riggers working at each site. And then each training organisation is required to keep an equipment log of parachutes used for descents by students, tandem instructors, and tandem parachutists. So note that that doesn't technically state sports jumps.
Yeah, right.
And so therefore there's no operational regulation prescribing a process for checking sports jumps equipment and that ensuring that it's fit for purpose. However, there is the requirement to check the reserves. And so they sort of talked about, well, what do you do when you check a reserve then? And essentially when they check a reserve, it's mainly around checking that it's in date and that it's been checked within the previous 12 months. And then if they've got an automatic activation device, the AAD, that it's not past the expiry. So they wouldn't have really necessarily looked at the compatibility between the two and that issue with the, I'm having a mental blank.
The closing loop, yeah.
Because they're not taking it out.
Yeah.
They're not taking it out to unfurl it all and then pack it all back in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're just saying that they're just going to look at it, be like, yep, it's been checked. Yep, it's within 12 months. And that they've got an automatic activation device.
Yeah.
And so it was hard to tell whether they would have necessarily picked this up for his anyway. And that there's no regulation or requirement to notify the drop zone safety officer of like if they've downsized or changed their equipment anyway in that canopy. You do have to have your parachutes checked on the first visit to a new drop zone, along with your licenses, etc. So when Toby had started diving at Skydive Australia in Cairns in Mission Beach, he would have had to have had it checked. But it sort of talked about like, well, he's a hugely experienced skydiver. So it actually may have been that he was probably more experienced than the riggers when he first started there anyway, or potentially was.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of them potentially would have been also looking to him for advice on how safe it was.
Yeah.
I also wonder how hard would it have been if like a rigger picked it up and was like, mate, this is not right. How easy would that have been to approach that as well?
And in the end, it was his own personal equipment. Even if someone did mention that to him, but he was comfortable with it, he'd be like,
That's fine.
It's fine.
It's
I
fine.
pack
happy with
my
it.
own.
Yeah.
I'm happy with it.
Yeah, and so they felt that like most people would have just accepted what he has packed because he was so experienced. There was also no requirement to keep any records of these inspections when they first started a new drop zone, so there was no record of Toby's being inspected in the first place. That, in theory, when they first arrive to a new drop zone, should be checking all equipment, not just a parachute. So, like, the helmet, the shoes, the jumpsuit, etc.
Like the harness that...
people are wearing and all that kind of stuff. And so, in theory, that would have been the ideal time to pick up on the closing pin, change your pressure. But again, that's not to say that he didn't show up to the drop zone with a different pack
different
and then
parachute.
change. But then there's no regulation to notify anyone that he's then changed to the downsize parachute and all that kind of stuff as well. Ultimately, the coroner did therefore accept or conclude that there should have been the opportunity to identify the incompatibility based on the fact that it should have been checked on the first time that he came there, and that was in December of 2016, assuming that he had in fact been using the same parachute the whole time.
Yeah.
So the final recommendations that ultimately came out of this inquest from the coroner was that, and these are really lengthy and quite wordy, so apologies, the initial certification process of the equipment should occur by the most skilled packers and riggers at that drop zone, and then ongoing inspection and review of equipment should be implemented by various appropriately skilled personnel. The coroner recommended that this should be considered to be incorporated into the APF regulations by way of a mandatory 6-monthly equipment checks of all sports rigs used at any drop zone. That the checking process should be documented. I really am a big fan of documenting things. Just personally.
Proof.
Yeah, because I was just like, no one really knows what he was doing or how often he'd done it or whether it had been checked in the first place. That these should be standardized with a checklist or something for all drop zones across Australia rather than just being like a suggestion. Let's just like actually make a checklist of what you should do and what is important. Because I think one thing that came out of this was like a lot of the expert witnesses who were very involved in the skydiving industry, when they were reading these operational regulations, had some varied understandings of what they actually meant or how to interpret those points. And so the coroner was like, let's make this very standardized, very clear, no misinterpretation in any way whatsoever. The next recommendation is proof of certification must be provided by the skydiver to the drop zone safety officer prior to undertaking the first jump using that equipment at any drop zone. So kind of increasing that like regulation of not just like the first time you show up, but the first time you use said equipment.
Oh yeah, that makes sense. Because you could get a new parachute.
Yeah.
But it's not been checked because you've been going there for a couple of years.
Yeah. And that, again, that this equipment check should comply with APF regulations along with CASA regulations, especially when it's a sports diver using their own equipment, that there should be a certification that the equipment is airworthy, either like because they're using a manufacturer produced equipment, so like it all comes from the one manufacturer and it's all standard. Or if you have changed portions or got portions from various manufacturers, that a rigger or a packer A, which are the highest classes of people that can check things, have certified that it's okay. Now, interestingly for me, that still means that, because you said there was conflict between how people have assessed even Toby's rig, there's still a potential there for some individual understanding. It's hard to standardize that specifically unless you're using one that's entirely one manufacturer set to be together.
Yeah.
Those riggers or packers could still potentially define things as safe, different to what someone else might have defined. But I guess at least that's still better than what's currently there. And then if there's any modifications, that there should be some certification around that, again, with the most senior people providing said certification, and that this should be all written and documented. The coroner then recommended that along with these initial checks, that there should be 6 monthly checks, and that the APF could also consider implementing something like a buddy check that even was used on a day-to-day basis to check our equipment and make sure that it's safe, which I think is a lot. And I think that that's hard, and I think that that'll be really difficult to implement in a commercial organisation. But if those sports jumps maybe are happening far less, then that might be more manageable. But I still think that's a lot.
Yeah.
Especially if you pack these all day, every day.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing you've used. Like, if you're getting it checked once every 6 months, I think that that's probably enough if you're doing the same thing day in, day out. Or at any point you change something. But I guess because it's so high risk, maybe a day-to-day because you've packed it slightly differently today, and that
it could
make such a difference. But Emma, you've also been like, you've got a reserve there for redundancy. So like, if your main chute's not packed appropriately, you've still got a spare.
Exactly.
So it's really hard to know what level of regulation you need for both.
You just don't want to get to a point where this becomes inaccessible. Well, I mean, it's probably quite an accessible sport anyway, but like it just becomes too overly regulated that people aren't going to want to do it.
Yeah, I definitely agree, because it seems like a lot of extra work. Basically, because CASA and APF had like been working so closely with this inquest, a lot of this was kind of in the process of happening, although maybe not quite. The coroner was a bit more heavy on the regulation than they had already implemented. But it sounds like CASA was already improving their regulations by way of further regulating commercial tandem operations as well as the sports parachuting community with regards to standardizing equipment and airworthiness of parachutes and that kind of thing. So it was already happening.
Yeah, it seemed like the skydiving company, they were as well being very proactive in terms of once the accident happened, they were looking at updating their procedures.
Yeah,
even
so
before the inquest went.
Australia had already implemented a new sports gear check procedure that stipulated how sports equipment should be used in skydiving, with some sign-offs as well for instructors, and every 6 months needing that to happen. But the coroner just provided that there should be a little bit extra in terms of that regulation, in terms of its wording as well, because it didn't really specify stuff around the tension on the closing loop.
Oh, okay.
And that should specifically be mentioned in there.
Yeah.
The coroner also recommended CASA look into scrutinising the requirements for keeping logbooks and developing a process to ensure informed consent from all participants as well. And talking about keeping logbooks, the coroner was kind of like, well, we should look into how you can make sure that you can access them in the future should there be electronic records like we mentioned in this case for like job logs and stuff, so that if there is better transparency to like what they had been doing. And then the last little bit that I have recorded in mine, because this is the first time I've seen anything like it in the inquest, and I thought I'd read the quote out, was that the coroner said, "To the family of Kerry, Peter and Toby, this process may not have eased your pain or answered all of your questions. Please know, however, that you have been heard. Go gently as you move on and find a way to heal your hearts." Which is a very
it's really nice.
personalised, lovely part of the inquest that I enjoyed.
I wonder if maybe didn't necessarily know them.
Yeah.
But like
it was a tight-knit community.
Yeah,
I
small
assume.
community. I don't know where the coroner was based, but
They're the Northern Coroner of Queensland, so I think it sounds like they were based out of Cairns as well.
yeah, so potentially they knew
This community.
yeah, the community or
Yeah.
someone who was involved somehow or yeah.
But I haven't seen nearly as a personalised message as that. Like, I really appreciate a lot of the coroners go into detailing the person who was involved, like, that the inquest
Is about. Yeah.
Yeah. Because you've got to acknowledge that these are individuals that have lost their lives and that we're trying to learn from that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was a good sentiment in terms of we're trying to improve.
Yeah. We're hoping to prevent this from happening again in the future. It's definitely an interesting one.
Split second. Like,
Yeah.
that's all it took.
It all changed in that split second.
Yeah. Whilst, there was concerns about his parachute, we don't think it had happened before, even though he'd used the same parachute.
This wouldn't have happened
Yeah.
if it wasn't in that, like, 1/10 of a second where he was directly underneath the tandem pair, and that's when the parachute happened to accidentally deploy. That is it's
that
just
for me.
The
insane.
coincidence of that is...
And that two people can collide in the air at such a velocity, because up until his parachute deployed, they were probably travelling at a similar velocity.
speed. Yep.
So,
Yeah, initially I was like, how did they die from that? But when you talk about
Yeah.
the speeds that they were going, it's like, okay,
Yeah.
it was just the relative speed.
Yeah. And I think it was mentioned very early on
Yeah.
in the inquest that they say there was a fatal collision in air. And I'm like, no, I'm going to need you to spell this
I'm
out
gonna
for
need
me
some
more. Yeah. Well, thanks for team working, because I think it was really interesting that we all could collaborate together.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.